What is Docker?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker is an open platform for developing, shipping, and running applications using containers to ensure they work across different environments. What is a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A Docker container is a lightweight, standalone executable package that includes everything needed to run a piece of software, including the code, runtime, system tools, libraries, and settings. What is Docker image?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A Docker image is a read-only template that contains a set of instructions for creating a container. Images can include an OS, app code, and dependencies. What is the difference between a Docker image and a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A Docker image is a blueprint for a container, while a container is a running instance of the image. What are the components of Docker architecture?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The main components include Docker Client, Docker Daemon, Docker Images, Docker Registries, and Docker Containers. What is Docker Hub?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker Hub is a cloud-based registry where Docker users can create, store, and distribute container images. It acts as a central repository for public and private images. How does Docker improve DevOps workflows?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker standardizes environments, makes deployments faster, enhances application isolation, and simplifies the CI/CD pipeline. How does Docker differ from traditional virtual machines?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker containers are lightweight and share the host OS kernel, whereas VMs are heavier, each running their own OS, which increases overhead. What is Docker Compose?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container Docker applications using a YAML file to configure application services. How do you use Docker Compose?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Define services in a Docker Compose.yml file. Then run Docker Compose up to start and orchestrate the defined containers. What is a Docker file?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A Docker file is a text file containing instructions to assemble a Docker image. It automates the process of creating a custom image. How do you optimize a Docker file?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use multi-stage builds. Minimize image size by avoiding unnecessary layers. And choose lightweight base images like Alpine. What is the difference between CMD and ENTRYPOINT in a Docker file?
3, 2, 1, 0.
CMD provides default commands and arguments for an executing container, while ENTRYPOINT sets a fixed executable that can't be overridden. What is the purpose of the expose instruction in Dockerfile?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The expose instruction informs Docker that the container will listen on a specified network port at runtime. What is a Docker volume?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker volumes provide persistent storage for containers, enabling data to survive container restarts and sharing data between containers. How do you create and use Docker volumes?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can create volumes using Docker volume create and mount them to containers using the V flag. When running containers. What is Docker Swarm?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker Swarm is Docker's native clustering and orchestration tool for managing a group of Docker engines as a single virtual system. How do you scale services in Docker Swarm?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can scale services using the Docker service scale command, which allows multiple instances of a container to be spun up. What is the difference between Docker Swarm and Kubernetes?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker Swarm is simpler to set up but less feature-rich, while Kubernetes offers more robust orchestration, scalability, and supports advanced features like auto-scaling. What are Docker networks?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker networks are used to allow communication between Docker containers and the outside world, as well as among containers. What are the types of Docker networks?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker supports 5 network drivers: Bridge, Host, Overlay, None, and McPlan, each serving different use cases. How do you create a Docker network?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can create a network using Docker network create and specify the network driver and name. What is the purpose of the Docker inspect command?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker inspect retrieves detailed information about Docker objects like containers, images, volumes, or networks in JSON format. How do you view logs of a running Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker logs less than container underscore ID greater than command to fetch logs from a running or stopped container. How do you remove Docker images and containers?
3, 2, 1, 0.
To remove a container, use Docker room less than container underscore ID greater than. For an image, use Docker RMI less than image underscore ID greater than. Ensure no running containers depend on the image. What is the purpose of the Docker exec command?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker exec is used to run commands in an already running container, allowing you to interact with the container's file system or environment. What is the difference between Docker run and Docker start?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker run creates a new container and starts it, while Docker start restarts an existing, stopped container. What are Docker labels?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker labels are key value pairs used to organize and manage Docker objects like images and containers by attaching metadata. How can you limit resource usage of a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can limit CPU and memory usage using the memory and CPUs flags when starting a container. What is the role of Docker daemon?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker daemon is a background process that manages Docker containers on the host system. It listens for Docker API requests and manages Docker objects like images, containers, and volumes. How do you list all running and stopped containers?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker PS to list running containers. To list all containers, running and stopped, use Docker PSA. What is a multi-stage build in Docker?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Multi-stage builds allow you to create Docker images with multiple stages, reducing image size by copying only necessary artifacts from one stage to the final image. How do you troubleshoot a container that's not starting?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Check the logs using Docker logs less than container underscore ID greater than. Inspect the container with Docker inspect less than container underscore ID greater than. And check the Docker daemon for potential issues. What is Docker's default storage driver?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker's default storage driver is Overlay 2, which allows the container's writable layer to sit on top of a read-only base image. How do you commit changes in a container to a new image?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker commit less than container underscore ID greater than less than new underscore image underscore name greater than to save the changes made in a running container as a new image. What is the difference between copy and ADD in Dockerfile?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Both are used to copy files into a container, but ADD supports features like extracting tar archives and copying files from URLs, while copy is simpler and more efficient. How can you pass environment variables to a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the env flag with Docker run to pass environment variables to the container. You can also specify variables in a Docker file using the env instruction. How do you restart a stopped Docker container automatically?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can use the restart flag with policies like always or on failure when running a container to ensure it restarts automatically if it stops or fails. What is Docker secret and how is it used?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker secret is a mechanism to securely store and manage sensitive data such as passwords, API keys, and certificates, and inject them into containers only at runtime. How do you run a container in detached mode?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the detach flag with the Docker run command to start a container in the background. Detached mode. What are Docker tags?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker tags are aliases for Docker images, allowing you to manage different versions of an image. such as latest v1.0 or custom names. How do you tag an image for pushing to a registry?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker tag less than image underscore ID greater than less than registry underscore URL greater than less than image underscore name greater than less than tag greater than to assign a tag before pushing the image to a registry. How do you pull a specific version of an image from Docker Hub?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker pull less than image underscore name greater than less than tag greater than command to pull a specific version of an image, where less than tag greater than is the version or label, such as Alpine 3.12. How do you remove dangling images in Docker?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker image prune command to remove dangling images, which are images that are not tagged and are not associated with a container. How do you stop all running containers at once?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker stop $Docker PSQ to stop all running containers by passing the container IDs returned by Docker PSQ. How do you build a Docker image from a Docker file?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Navigate to the directory containing the Docker file and run docker build t less than image underscore name greater than to build the image. How do you inspect network settings of a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker inspect less than container underscore ID greater than command and check the network settings section to view the container's IP address, port mappings, and other network details. How do you assign a container a static IP address in Docker?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker network create subnet equals less than subnet greater than less than network underscore name greater than to create a network with a specified subnet. Then use Docker run network equals less than network underscore name greater than IP equals less than static underscore IP greater than to assign a static IP to a container. What is a Docker context?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker context allows users to switch between multiple Docker environments, such as local and remote Docker hosts, without needing to configure Docker every time. What is the purpose of Docker's HEALTHCHECK instruction?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The HEALTHCHECK instruction in a Docker file defines a command that Docker runs to check if the container is still working properly. What is the Docker save and Docker load command?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker save creates a tarball of one or more images which can be transferred between systems, while Docker load is used to import that tarball back into Docker. What is Docker build kit?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker build kit is a modern, efficient build system for Docker that improves the performance and usability of Docker builds by adding features like parallel execution and enhanced caching. How can you troubleshoot slow Docker builds?
3, 2, 1,
Use build cache properly. Avoid large images. Use multi-stage builds. And minimize the number of layers in the Docker file. Profiling tools like Docker build progress equals plain can help identify bottlenecks. What is the role of the Docker CLI?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The Docker command line interface (CLI) is the tool used to interact with Docker, allowing users to issue commands like Docker run, Docker build, and Docker push. How do you remove unused Docker networks?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker Network Prune to remove all unused networks not currently in use by containers. What are Docker labels used for?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker labels are metadata you can attach to Docker objects like images and containers for purposes like organization, automation, or management of resources. How do you update a running container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You cannot update a running container directly. You need to stop it. Create a new container with the updated configuration, and start the new container. How do you clean up unused Docker objects?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker System Prune to remove unused containers, images, networks, and volumes to free up space. How can you monitor Docker container performance?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Tools like Docker Stats, or third-party solutions like Prometheus and Grafana can be used to monitor CPU, memory, network, and disk usage. What is the purpose of the Docker ignore file?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The Docker ignore file is used to exclude files and directories from the Docker build context, similar to git ignore, reducing the size of the build and improving performance. How do you list all Docker volumes on a system?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker volume ls command to list all the volumes created on the Docker host. How do you remove a Docker volume?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker volume room less than volume underscore name greater than command to remove a specific Docker volume, provided it is not being used by a container. How do you connect a running container to an existing network?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker network connect less than network underscore name greater than less than container underscore ID greater than command to connect a running container to a new or existing Docker network. How do you check the version of Docker installed?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker version or Docker version command to check the Docker client and server version. How do you configure Docker to use a proxy?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Configure the proxy settings by defining environment variables like http_proxy, https_proxy, and no_proxy either in the Docker daemon or container level configuration. How do you set resource limits for a Docker service in Docker Swarm?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can define resource limits using limit CPU and limit memory flags when deploying services. In Docker Swarm, what is a dangling Docker volume?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A dangling volume is an unused Docker volume that was created but not currently attached to any containers. How do you view a container's environment variables?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker inspect less than container underscore ID greater than and look under the config env section to see all environment variables set in the container. How do you pause and unpause a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker pause less than container underscore ID greater than to temporarily halt a container's processes and Docker unpause less than container underscore ID greater than to resume them. What is the purpose of the Docker entrypoint instruction?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The entrypoint instruction in a Docker file specifies a command that will always run as the main process of the container, making it useful for defining container behavior. How do you rename a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker rename less than old underscore name greater than less than new underscore name greater than to rename a running or stopped container. How do you create a new tag for an existing image?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker tag less than image underscore ID greater than less than new underscore tag greater than command to assign a new tag to an existing image. How do you check disk usage by Docker objects?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker system df to display the disk usage of images, containers, volumes, and build caches on the Docker host. What is the Docker history command?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The Docker history less than image greater than command shows the history of an image, listing each layer created and the corresponding commands used. How do you copy files between your host and a running Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker cp less than host underscore path greater than less than container underscore ID greater than less than container underscore path greater than to copy files to a container, and Docker cp less than container underscore ID greater than less than container underscore path greater than less than host underscore path greater than to copy files from the container to the host. What is a Docker build context?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The Docker build context is the set of files at a specified location, often the current directory, that Docker uses to build an image. Files from the context are sent to the Docker daemon during the build. How do you configure logging drivers in Docker?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can set logging drivers using the log driver option in Docker Run, or configure them globally in the Docker daemon's configuration file. Supported drivers include JSON file, syslog, and Fluented. How can you export and import a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker export less than container underscore ID greater than to save the file system of a container to a tarball. And Docker import to create an image from that tarball. How do you run a container in privileged mode?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the privileged flag with Docker run to start a container with elevated privileges, allowing it to access all devices on the host. How do you view the current configuration of Docker daemon settings?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker info to display the current configuration and settings of the Docker daemon, including storage drivers, network options, and more. How do you configure a container to run as a specific user?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the user flag with Docker run or define the user instruction in the Docker file to specify the user for the container process. What is the purpose of the Docker events command?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker events allows you to monitor real-time events from the Docker daemon, such as container creation, deletion, start, stop, etc. How do you configure Docker to log to external services like AWS CloudWatch or Fluentd?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker supports external logging drivers like AWS CloudWatch and Fluentd. You configure them in the daemon's JSON configuration or via the log driver option with Docker run. What is Docker checkpoint and restore?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker checkpoint allows you to freeze a running container's state to disk and restore it later, essentially pausing and resuming containers. This feature is useful for live migration and backups. How do you use Docker in a CI/CD pipeline?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker can automate CI/CD pipelines by building, testing, and deploying applications in isolated containers. Docker images can be pushed to registries and deployed in production environments automatically. How do you configure a container to restart on failure?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the restart on failure flag with Docker run to automatically restart the container if it exits due to failure. You can specify a maximum number of retries if needed. How do you inspect the configuration of a Docker network?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker network inspect less than network underscore name greater than command to view the details of a specific Docker network, including connected containers, subnet, and IP addressing. How do you create a custom Docker network with a specific subnet?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker network create subnet equals less than subnet underscore address greater than less than network underscore name greater than to create a custom network with a specified IP range. What is the default logging driver in Docker?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The default logging driver in Docker is JSON file, which stores logs in JSON format on the host. How do you run multiple commands in a Docker file?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use listen and to chain commands in a single run instruction in a Docker file. Alternatively, use multiple run instructions, but combining them reduces image size by minimizing the number of layers. What is the purpose of the Docker attach command?
3, 2, 1, 0.
The Docker attach command allows you to connect to a running container's standard input, output, and error streams, similar to Docker exec but without starting a new process. How do you secure communication between Docker clients and Docker daemon?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use TLS certificates to encrypt communication between Docker clients and the Docker daemon. You can generate certificates for both client and server, and configure the daemon to enforce them. How do you override environment variables when running a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can override environment variables by using the env flag in Docker run or by specifying environment variables in Docker Compose files. How do you set up a Docker registry on a private server?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the official Docker registry image. Docker run dp 5000 to 5000, name registry. 2. To set up a private registry for storing and sharing Docker images within your organization. What is the difference between a Docker overlay network and bridge network?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Overlay networks are used in Docker Swarm mode for multi-host communication, while bridge networks are used for communication between containers on the same host. How can you manage Docker container log size?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can limit the log file size and rotate logs using the log_opt max size and log_opt max file options with Docker run, or configure them globally in the daemon's configuration. What are Docker capabilities, and how do you manage them?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker capabilities are sets of permissions that define what operations containers can perform on the host system. You can add or drop capabilities using the cap add and cap drop flags in Docker run. How do you automate Docker builds with webhooks?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can set up automated Docker builds with webhooks by linking a Docker repository, such as Docker Hub, to a GitHub or Bitbucket repository. Webhooks trigger builds when code is pushed to the linked repository. How do you monitor Docker daemon resource usage?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker system df command to display disk usage by images, containers, and volumes. Use third-party tools like Prometheus or native Docker commands. Docker stats for CPU, memory, and network usage. How do you export logs from a Docker container for analysis?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can use the Docker logs less than container underscore ID greater than logfile.txt command to save logs to a file, or configure Docker logging drivers to export logs directly to external systems like Elasticsearch or Fluented. What are Docker node labels, And how are they used in Docker Swarm?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker node labels are key value pairs that you can assign to nodes to categorize them. In Swarm, these labels are used to control service placement by specifying constraints in the Docker service. Commands. How do you set memory limits in a Docker container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the memory flag in Docker run to limit the maximum amount of memory a container can use. E.g., Docker run memory equals 512 meters. What is Docker multi-host networking?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker multi-host networking allows containers running on different Docker hosts to communicate with each other. It can be achieved using overlay networks in Docker Swarm mode or external tools like Weave. How do you connect Docker containers to an external database?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can connect containers to an external database by using environment variables to parse database credentials and specifying the external database's host and port in your container's configuration. How do you manage Docker secrets in a Docker Swarm cluster?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker Secret Create to store secrets securely and Docker Service Create or Docker Service Update with the secret flag to mount secrets into containers at runtime. What are Docker Content Trust, DCT, and Docker Notary?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker Content Trust ensures the integrity and publisher authenticity of Docker images by signing images with Notary. You can enable DCT by setting the Docker_content_trust=1 environment variable. How do you remove a Docker image that is being used by a stopped container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
First, remove the stopped container using Docker room less than container_ID greater than. And then remove the image using Docker RMI less than image_ID greater than. What is Docker multi-arch support?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker multi-arch allows you to build and publish images for different CPU architectures, e.g., ARM, x86, using a single image repository. The Docker build X command is used for creating multi-arch images. How do you limit the number of restart attempts for a container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the restart on failure less than max_attempts greater than flag with Docker run to limit the number of times a container will attempt to restart after a failure. How do you copy files into a stopped container?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can still use Docker CP to copy files into a stopped container. After copying, the container can be restarted with the new files. What is the difference between Docker Run and Docker Create?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker Run creates and starts a container in one step, while Docker Create only creates a container without starting it. You can later start the container using Docker Start. How do you execute a shell command inside a running Docker container?
3,
Use the Docker execut less than container underscore ID greater than less than command to execute a shell command, e.g. bin bash, inside a running container interactively. What are Docker Swarm services and tasks?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A service defines how a container runs in a swarm, while a task is a single instance of a service running on a node. Tasks are the atomic units that Docker Swarm schedules. How do you inspect changes made to a container's file system?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker diff less than container underscore ID greater than to list the changes made to a container's file system, showing added, modified, and deleted files. How do you create a Docker container from a tarball?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can import a container from a tarball using Docker import less than tarball greater than and then run a container from the resulting image. How do you inspect Docker image metadata?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker inspect less than image underscore ID greater than to view detailed metadata about an image, including its layers, environment variables, and configuration options. What is the difference between Docker's bridge network and host network?
3, 2, 1, 0.
In a bridge network, Docker containers have their own network namespaces, while in a host network, containers share the same network namespace as the Docker host. This allows containers in a host network to use the host's IP. How do you scale a service in Docker Swarm?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker service scale less than service underscore name greater than equals less than replicas greater than to increase or decrease the number of replicas running for a service in Docker Swarm. How do you create a read-only container in Docker?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the read-only flag with Docker run to start a container with a read-only file system, preventing modifications inside the container. How do you connect Docker containers running on different hosts?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can connect Docker containers across hosts using Docker Swarm's overlay networks or third-party tools like Weave or Calico for multi-host networking. What is the purpose of the Docker wait command?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Docker wait blocks until the specified container stops and then prints its exit code. This is useful in automation scripts where you need to know when a container finishes. How do you configure Docker for IPv6?
3, 2, 1, 0.
You can enable IPv6 support in Docker by editing the Docker daemon configuration file /etc/docker/daemon.json to include the IPv6 key, and then restart Docker. How do you run a Docker container in interactive mode?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the it flag with Docker run to start a container in interactive mode, allowing you to interact with the container via a shell. For example, Docker run at less than image greater than bin bash. How do you enable Docker content caching for faster builds?
3, 2,
Docker's build kit by enabling it with docker_buildkit equals 1 Docker build for improved caching and parallel execution, which speeds up the build process. What is the Docker volume lifecycle?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A Docker volume's lifecycle is independent of containers. Volumes are created with Docker volume create, attached to containers at runtime, and can persist data even after containers are removed. How do you configure Docker to use non-root privileges?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Create a Docker user group and add your user to it using sudo usermod ag_docker username greater than. Then log out and back in to use Docker without sudo. How do you set up a reverse proxy for Docker containers?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use nginx or treefig as a reverse proxy to route requests to Docker containers based on domain names or URL paths. You can configure the proxy in a Docker Compose file or manually with Docker networks. What is Docker's default isolation mechanism on Linux?
3, 2, 1, 0.
On Linux, Docker uses namespaces and C groups to isolate containers. Namespaces provide separation for processes, and C groups control resource usage. How do you perform a rolling update in Docker Swarm?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the Docker service update command with the update parallelism and update delay flags to control how many tasks are updated at a time during a rolling update. What are Docker scratch images?
3, 2, 1, 0.
A scratch image is an empty base image used to build lightweight Docker containers that contain only the application and its dependencies, reducing the container's size. How do you update a Docker Compose service without downtime?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use Docker Compose up, no deps d less than service underscore name greater than to update a specific service without stopping dependent services. You can also use rolling updates in conjunction with Docker Swarm for zero downtime deployments. How do you start a Docker container with a custom DNS server?
3, 2, 1, 0.
Use the DNS flag with Docker run to specify a custom DNS server for the container. E.g., Docker run DNS equals 8.8.8.8 less than image greater than